This morning at 11:30, we were talking about the Digital Accountability and Transparency Act, the Data Act, which is the first open data law. Last year, Congress decided to require the federal government to move to open data for all spending information. Well, that was our coalition's first challenge. We lobbied in favor of the Data Act, and it passed, and now we're trying to get it implemented. Our next challenge is what we're going to be talking about this afternoon, and some of the leaders in that area are with me here up on the panel. The Financial Transparency Act, which Congressman Darrell Issa introduced in May, this past May, seeks to require the whole government to move toward open data for financial regulation. So you can think of the Financial Transparency Act, if you listened to our talks about the Data Act this morning, just try to mentally transfer all of those principles from the spending world into the banking and securities and financial reporting world. Easy job, right? Not too easy. I'm excited to be joined by a couple of panelists who are at the center of this. Daniel Castro is the director of the Center for Data Innovation, representing the technology industry. Matt Goulding is a legislative assistant to Congressman Darrell Issa and is the point person in Congress for the Financial Transparency Act. So the first thing I'm going to do, if you were here this morning, you'll remember that we ran out of time after people's introductions. We're not going to do that this time. I'm going to ask each of them to come up, introduce themselves, and describe what this transformation looks like from their perspective and why it's so important. I've got a couple of questions for them, and then we will have time. We won't have to slide all the way to the benediction this time. We will have time for you all to provide input. And so I'm going to go first to my immediate left. You know what? No, I'm going to reverse that. We're going to talk to the leadership of the Financial Transparency Act first. So I'd like to ask you to join me in welcoming Congressman Issa's legislative assistant, Matt Goulding.
Thank you, Hudson, for that wonderful introduction. We're going to talk about a topic that's not always topping the list of things that are on fire or things that are the most important on the legislative agenda for Congress, but it's one that's very important nonetheless. So first, I'd like to thank Socrata for the opportunity to speak to you all today regarding Congressman Issa's latest transparency initiative. So basically, the Financial Transparency Act will transform U.S. financial regulatory reporting from the current system of disconnected documents from the 80s and 90s into standardized open data suitable for the 21st century. I'm sure that that's music to everyone's ears here. Yeah. So basically, as Hudson alluded, we have the most complicated financial regulatory system in the world. Most countries in the developed world have 2 or 3 agencies regulating their financial systems, but there are 8 different financial regulators in the United States, in addition to a few other quasi-governmental organizations, without going too deeply into those. But the U.S. financial regulators, for the most part, don't use standardized data fields and formats for the information they collect. Most, in fact, are still using document-based forms in which information is just expressed as plain text. So, how many of you have ever tried to search a PDF document?
Control F.
And you know how difficult that can be. Basically, in order for an investor to make an educated decision, or for the regulator themselves to make a decision based on the information that's been disclosed by a public company or a financial firm, they would have to, in a matter of minutes or even seconds, compare and contrast information from thousands of different plain text PDF documents or HTML documents, which is virtually impossible. Actually, in that time frame, it's absolutely impossible. But over time, third-party organizations have developed to pull that information out and to aggregate it in at least spreadsheets. So we have a little bit of a stopgap, but it's a part of our regulatory industry that very sorely needs updating. So standardized open data would be better for investors, like I've said, better for the regulated entity, and even better for the regulator as well. Data can be automatically reported and instantly analyzed. Documents instead have to be manually reviewed, and the information in them has to be converted into data before it can be analyzed electronically. Any resistance toward implementing these types of formats is mostly due to the force of momentum, which we're very familiar with in the case of very large bureaucracies which comprise the U.S. government. Even regulatory officials themselves will personally welcome this type of advancement while very cautiously approaching any new mandate from Congress, which is no surprise, Dodd-Frank. For example, nearly 10 years ago, the FDIC began its transition to the XBRL open data format for its call reports. Its success is basically a gold standard for this type of advancement. As another great example, the National Credit Union Administration had quite a task in creating a submission tool that would accommodate all credit unions, big and small, without creating a substantial compliance burden. So basically, the result is a web interface that simplifies the submission process while allowing larger organizations to automate these compliance tasks. So that's basically the goal here, is we want to empower the third-party sector to write code, to come up with programs, to automate these tasks, to lessen the regulatory burden, and to perfect the data that's coming out as a result of these regulatory requirements. Despite these successes, the U.S. financial regulators are still using documents where standardized data would work much better. The SEC requires every public company to disclose its subsidiaries as part of its annual report, Form 10-K. Unfortunately, it's just a list of names of each subsidiary, which is basically a blob of text. It's not searchable. It's virtually useless. This means there's no way for investors or analysts to automatically search through the information that's available about each subsidiary. Text analysis software, as I alluded to earlier, can usually isolate each name, but even after that, since there's no consistent electronic identifier code, it's difficult to connect each name with other records and data sets that pertain to each subsidiary company. The SEC should switch from a blob of text, for obvious reasons, to a series of data fields, but it's obviously failed to do so at this point. To transform any area of government information into open data, there are two steps. First, you have to standardize, then you have to publish, which is usually mandated by statute. Without common data fields and formats, even if it's available online, the information, again, is virtually worthless in many cases. The SEC did implement a trial program in 2009, which adopted XBRL as an open data format alongside traditional reporting methods like PDFs and HTML documents, and this was a big step in the right direction because by 2011, most public companies and financial firms were reporting in XBRL, but the problem was the quote-unquote trial program never actually ended. And now the SEC continues to require the submission of nearly every form it collects in both formats, which as the critics point out, is an increased regulatory burden. As a matter of fact, we've heard calls in Congress to provide an exemption from XBRL reporting. The critics say that this additional burden should be alleviated, whereas the fact is that they're right. But we think instead of providing this exemption, we should do away with the antiquated formats and perfect the XBRL data that's coming out. So we should essentially finish what the SEC started, and we believe the Financial Transparency Act will do just that. By changing the law to assume that everything reported to the SEC and other regulators is reported in an open data format, the Financial Transparency Act creates a fundamental shift in the way we think about financial reporting. This will do away with the antiquated, unsearchable, disconnected, and frankly useless methods of reporting that should have been abolished at the beginning of the 21st century. Congressman Issa wants the Financial Transparency Act to be known as the Data Act 2.0, as a nod to the Data Act that Hudson mentioned earlier, because it does for the financial industry basically what the Data Act did for federal spending. Where the Data Act allows everyone to access open data for federal spending, the Financial Transparency Act will do the very same thing for any financial regulatory information required to be made public by statute. And it makes it available for bulk download, for use by third parties, by individuals. So that's where we're headed. So hopefully with your support we can continue the march. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks very much. Our organization, the Data Transparency Coalition, and our members, we're very grateful for the leadership of Congressman Issa and his staff pursuing, sometimes, as Matt says, legislative change is needed. There ought to be a law. Sometimes that's not frivolous. Sometimes that's actually true. In the case of the Financial Transparency Act, I think it is. I'm excited next to get the perspective of the technology industry on what this would mean. Please join me in welcoming the director of the Center for Data Innovation, Daniel Castro.
Thanks, Hudson. And thanks, Matt, too, for being here today. Let me just start by telling you about the Center for Data Innovation. We're a nonprofit think tank based here in Washington, D.C., and our focus has really been on the intersection of data technology and public policy. So we started this up about 2 years ago because whenever we have conversations here in Washington, and even we actually saw this at state and local governments as well, whenever we started having conversations about why we should be investing in this particular data project or that particular data project, people would always get scared and they'd say, oh, government can't do technology very well, or what about privacy and security when you collect all this data, or just we're not interested in data, we're interested in solving this other problem over here. And we wanted to help policymakers understand that solving the big, important public policy challenges that exist today often involve using data, and you have to understand how data is being applied and how it's being effective in government, in the private sector, and with nonprofits if you want to see change in whatever public policy challenge you're trying to tackle, whether it's healthcare, whether it's education, whether it's financial reform. And so we've approached the work that we do from the perspective of what are the big challenges out there where data can have an impact, and how can we educate policymakers about these opportunities. So we've done things like assess open data policies, and we've gone out, we've put together 12 actionable steps for what Congress can do to kind of move forward on data. And one of these important issues that we put out in this year's legislative agenda was specifically around this idea of XBRL data with the SEC. And this is, as Matt said, this is really kind of fundamentally important to how the SEC envisions how it operates in the future and how it's providing value to citizens and businesses and regulators and everyone else kind of in this ecosystem. First, you just have to look at what's happening today, and you realize that duplicative reporting is, it's just one of those things that can only happen in Washington, where you have companies, filing paper documents and filing, the electronic machine-readable documents, and those don't have to match, and one of them doesn't even have to be right. And you kind of ask, well, of course, why would anyone use the data? Why would this have any value? Why would anyone ensure that it's accurate and reliable? And of course, they're not until we make this change. The second part is you have to look and see how the SEC is operating today. Right now, there's about 600 forms that the SEC requires. Most of those are not being filed electronically. Most of those are not being machine readable. And when you look at how government agencies have been transformed through digitization, that's not the direction we want to go. So we want to have really to see a fundamental policy shift in how the agency operates to create this new value. And the third thing you want to look at is basically how this data can be used and what the trends are in technology. And the big opportunity, of course, around data right now is through analytics, through using machine learning and other types of analytical techniques to achieve more with the data that you have. And so, if you've followed the news lately, there was an interesting study that came out it was either last week or the week before from MIT, where there was a machine learning algorithm that was able to have better intuition, they said, than a human on some prediction. If you look at what the US Patent Office is doing with the patent view, they're really coming in and they're saying, how can we help our patent inspectors leverage the technology that we have, leverage the data that we have to more effectively review patents? And this is the same type of experimental approach to government and data that we want to see the SEC take on. We want regulators to say, we have very limited amount of time, we have a ton of data out there, how can we start leveraging data and analytics to more selectively target certain companies based on the ones that we think we should be spending our time on? And you want to see that coming from lots of angles, not just government, but any kind of nonprofit regulators or individuals providing oversight as well. So I just want to end here by talking about, when we look at kind of where we are today and where we want to go. The technology is here today. And so, what I, am encouraging you to go out and do is talk to policymakers about what you're able to achieve today with technology, what you're able to achieve today with data, and how those lessons can be applied in other sectors. This, I think, is one of the biggest opportunities right now at the federal level for how we can see immediate impact from data, how we can see immediate impact that has value for consumers, that has value for businesses, has value for regulators. But we have to kind of really shift the culture and mentality of how these government agencies work. They have to kind of start embedding data into their DNA. They have to have a data-first mentality to these problems. And that's not where we are today. And when you look at how change happens in these organizations, you have to look at kind of what I think the motivators are to get people to finally do things in a very different way. And when it comes to this area right here, it's really because of people like Hudson and Matt who have focused on this problem and brought attention to it that we're seeing the change that we have today. But it's very hard to get that. And so I think it's really important that we have these conversations in a room like this, where we have people that are both politically engaged, understand data, because you're the ones that have to really bring these problems and raise awareness about how these can change and make an impact. So let me stop there, and we'll continue the conversation.
Thanks very much. I'm going to keep sitting here. So there's no leader. What's happening? I've got one question for Daniel, and then one question for Matt, and then I'm going to throw it open. I think I want to ask a question of y'all first. Do any of you work for one of the 8 financial regulatory agencies? Good. Well, if you were, I would ask you to come up and join the panel and speak for yourself. But we'll be talking about that sector. I've got other questions. But first, I'd like to ask Daniel, with the Center for Data Innovation's connections across the technology industry, suppose this change happens. Suppose the whole structure of the information that is reported to financial regulators, suppose that is transformed from documents into open data. What does that mean for the technology industry? What are the things the technology industry will be able to do, and what should they do?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's great. I mean, really what we're talking about is finally being able to harness this data for reporting, for compliance, for fraud and risk analysis. I think the best comparison is really to tax filings today. And if you look and see what the IRS is doing, it used to be this very paper-based system. You'd file your taxes, you'd be, basically putting some kind of lottery. Maybe your filing would be taken out, and they'd look at it. It was a very ineffective way of doing compliance and enforcing the tax code. It's the same thing that we'd have in this system, where you can kind of move from a very ineffective, low efficiency government operation to one that is very high value add, where you can actually use this data to figure out what companies are performing well. You can do comparisons across industries. You can see what industry trends are. You can have companies and investors use this data to figure out where they should be putting money. You can have successful companies that maybe their data is kind of somewhat hidden or their values hidden. I mean, basically you now have kind of the Moneyball mentality that was applied in baseball. You can actually apply this to the real economy. So there's just this huge opportunity to finally take all the analytics technology that right now we're using mostly to serve up ads to people and actually use it to drive value in the economy. And that's huge. I mean, that's just a huge fundamental change in how we do regulation. And that's why, as I said, I think when we talk about how Congress can have an impact, this has to be one of the top issues, and it's not getting enough attention yet. But hopefully, I think we're starting to see change there, and we're going to really see a tremendous value from this.
Thanks so much. We'll get to questions in a moment about this transformation and the legislation that's driving it. But to illuminate what the conversation is like between Congress and the regulatory agencies that will have to do all of this work if the Financial Transparency Act passes, I'd like to ask Matt, just judging from the substance of this proposal and judging from the conversations that you've had with financial regulators, how do you think the Financial Transparency Act would change the way that these agencies do business?
First of all, I just wanted to highlight a term that Daniel used earlier, and I think I'm going to shamelessly steal it for future use, is the data-first mentality. I think that really gets to the heart of what we're doing here. As an example, when Mr. Issa, we moved into a new office, the first thing he wanted to do was rip out all the file cabinets. Because if you've ever been in a congressional office, you'll see that most walls are lined with file cabinets. We don't have anything in them at all. And if there is anything, it's definitely not paper. So that's sort of the direction that we want to move in. We want to stop using documents. We want to move toward usable data. I mean, this has been so obvious that a number of most Fortune 500 companies have moved to software that utilizes this type of data. I mean, it's been so painfully obvious that regulators should have adopted this decades ago that I can't think of another scenario that's so obvious, to be honest with you. But the second thing is to automate the compliance tasks. Once you move to a requirement, as Daniel said, for this type of data, it just empowers the third-party industry to start writing code. And that just becomes a beautiful thing. And especially from my boss's position on this, it's going to actually, in even the short run, reduce the regulatory burden on businesses, which frees them up to use that capital in ways that'll be more well spent and to build the economy. Adopting common fields like the LEI, another pretty obvious addition.
Let's dig into that for a second. Could you want to tell the audience? First, I'll ask, who is familiar with the LEI already? I see a couple of hands. Ken Malero is familiar with the LEI from Socrata. Good. Stu Rosenberg is not. You should be familiar. Anyway, why don't you describe what the legal entity identifier is and why it matters?
So basically, it's actually probably for the level that the majority of you are on with an understanding of data, it's actually a pretty simple step. It basically just identifies companies and their subordinate organizations or their subsidiaries with a unique identifier code, and it's basically just as simple as that. And we haven't even gotten to a point where the same identifier codes are used for the same regulated entities within the same regulator, or heaven forbid, across all the regulators. So it's actually a very simple step, I think, and hopefully our bill will pave the way toward actually implementing that.
LEI means the legal entity identifier. I was hoping that we would each say one of the terms.
Entity.
Yeah.
Identifier.
Okay, I see a lot of questions bubbling there. And this time, unlike the last time I moderated a panel for half an hour, this time we've got time for questions. So I'd like to, I'll stand up so I can see better. What questions do we have? Yes, sir.
Well, I have two questions. Daniel, what is meant by data in your language? And what is meant by value? You use those two terms a lot. Data can have many different meanings and value.
Yeah. Well, in this
And I'll repeat the question first, just for the benefit of posterity. First, what is meant by data? And second, what is meant by value, especially as used by the Center for Data Innovation?
Sure. So in my remarks here, I was referring to government information. And I used...
So what your specifics?
Yeah, so I mean, I include basically any information that the government collects. And now within that, there are some information that's high value and low value, and I'll get to the value in a minute. If you are talking about federal government, which was I am, the history of information management goes back quite a bit to 60s and 70s, where there was this whole government information resource management theory and practice.
What kind of information are you talking about?
Yeah, well, so for SEC specifically, we're talking about everything that's in these reports. So that includes company earnings, information about the officers and their interactions, their transactions that they have. It includes basically the entire financial statement for the company. Hudson, you actually know more of this than I do. Do you want to add on that?
Well, I think what we've tried to work on pursuing the Financial Transparency Act is to look at the whole universe of information that's reported to financial regulators under the securities laws, the commodities laws, the Banking Act. And I think there are plenty of ways to dig into more detail, but with each of these domains, there's a need to go from documents to data. Go ahead, Matt.
I'm much less of a detail guy, so I'll take it to the 30,000-foot view. Being a public company it's a privilege, and it signifies some degree of public trust. And in going public, in taking a company public, you get greater access to capital. as a result of that public trust. So by statute, this information is all required to be made public. It's just that right now it's being made public. Sometimes, in most cases, it's not available in bulk for download. It's made available in PDFs, HTML documents, things that are not searchable. So in many cases, it's worthless. If you wanted to download the financial information of 5 different companies, you would have to download those PDF documents, look at the corresponding blanks on each one, type it in manually into a spreadsheet or whatever the case may be, whatever software has been written to do that, and then you would have to crunch the numbers in that way. This is why this will specifically, in my personal opinion, benefit smaller companies in a big way. And that's because right now, if you look at a blue chip company like Intel, Microsoft, etc., you can just Google Google or Google Microsoft, any public company, and you can see their financial information sliced and diced a million different ways. I mean, they're just pages and pages and pages. A newly IPO'd or a newly offered public company doesn't have the benefit of that same analysis because their information is not, well, number one, it's not as desirable, there's not as much demand, but if you were an investor trying to figure out what new company in which you should invest your money, you wouldn't have access to that same information because it's not made available in that way. We believe that in that way, it will help small companies by reducing the risk premium associated with their securities. I mean, there are so many benefits on the horizon when it comes to data transparency.
And we've clearly got the passion as well. We're excited for that. We're grateful for Mr. Ice's leadership and his staff. Are there other questions from the audience for now? Sir.
Yeah, actually a question for Matt in terms of the kind of the political implications it's going to have. Because I mean, you work up on the Hill, obviously, and I mean, there's a question of if we make data more available, will it make our political processes any better?
And I'll repeat the question for posterity. The question is about the political implications of this change. If we make financial regulatory filings available as open data, what will that mean politically?
Or data in general.
Or government information in general as open data. What does it mean for politics?
Specifically for the political situation right now, and I'll take it in this particular way, and if we need to clarify and move in another, we can definitely do that. But I think that the breadth of our co-sponsorship, of the co-sponsors we have on this bill, speaks to the bigger picture. We have members like my boss who took a company through an initial public offering himself before becoming a member of Congress. And he's obviously a Republican. We have the second most senior member of the Financial Services Committee on the Democratic side, Ms. Maloney, who is a representative of Manhattan. Just right there. I mean, the lineup that you have. Also on the Democratic side, we have Congressman Jared Polis of Colorado, who has spawned a number of .coms and taken companies through IPOs as well. We have Mr. Delaney, who is really big in the banking sector. Mr. McHenry, who is the Chief Deputy Whip, who's actually a member of leadership, who's really big on data transparency. I mean, it just really shows that we span the gamut here. And in terms of political messaging, it gets even better, honestly, because there's something for everyone. On the Republican side, you know, we get to say that basically it's better for investors, because it is. But on the Democratic side, where you might be more aligned with investor protection, not saying that we're not, but it's a matter of emphasis, you can say that with more data, you basically you can prevent Madoff-style fraud. For a pretty good example. I mean, Mr. Madoff was reporting fraudulent information, not only fraudulent information to 2 different regulators, but to multiple different offices within the same regulator. And because these offices, these sub-offices, and these sub-entities are so divorced and they're so devoid of transparency and really actionable data, he was able to get away with what he did and defraud the American people for such a long time, the likes of which may not have been seen since. So this is the goal. We really believe that this is something that benefits everyone. Regulators get access to better actionable data. Investors get access to better actionable data. The regulated entities over time, as third-party organizations take up the task of writing software to automate those compliance tasks, the regulatory burden is reduced. I mean, this is something that is really bipartisan multi-partisan if you look at it in that regard. But there's really no one that doesn't like this, and that's why to this day, I've been working on this for almost a year now. This is actually an amendment that my boss offered to Dodd-Frank. This is how far back this notion goes. But I can genuinely say that at this point, there is no one who has lodged any type of real dissent to this bill, either official or unofficial. And if you have a reason why we shouldn't move forward, I invite you to give me a call.
Speak now,
like
forever hold your peace.
Absolutely.
We're running out of time. The next panel will be talking about, I'm going to just give you the preview, data-driven Fed. The next panel will be talking about performance management and about what future administrations can do with government data to drive and to improve performance. We're thrilled for that. I'm going to stay and listen to that one. But if you'd like to ask questions of our panel, you'll be able to find them right outside the double doors. Please join me. We've got Daniel Castro, the director of the Center for Data Innovation, Matt Goulding, legislative assistant to Congressman Issa. Please join me in thanking them.